historians will ponder the extent to which Biden was in control of his own presidency and his administration, particularly in the latter stages. I do think a lot of Americans felt that they had been misled. They could see that they had been misled. This was an administration and his officials that said day after day, week after week, the president's fine. And this was what was such a gift to Trump. Trump's whole message always is, these elites are lying to you the entire time.
He's an institutionalist by nature. He reveres the institutions that make America great. Whereas Donald Trump has so often seemed to want to burn those institutions down and be a flamethrower.
He's a man who uniquely was able, it's clear, among the Democratic field in 2020, was uniquely able to bury Donald Trump, but he wasn't able to extinguish him.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the Newsagents live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester the following week on the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates. The link will be in the description below, and we're very excited to see you there.
I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. This is a dangerous and that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. The dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy.
That was Joe Biden's farewell from the White House before Donald Trump takes over. 4 years ago, Joe Biden was the man who was talking about America united, about polarization ending, about the country coming back together again. If that was his aim, he's failed.
But there is a lot more to the Biden presidency. The last 4 years, 4 tumultuous, event-filled years than just the ghost of Donald Trump alone. So before the page turns, we thought we'd take a moment to consider the man, the presidency, the legacy, where he might yet sit in history. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And I'm on a minor detour back from Australia, where I seem to have taken the wrong turn out of Kuala Lumpur, and I'm now in Istanbul.
Oh, I know why. You're going to check the Bosphorus for the bodies of your enemies.
Exactly.
Very, very important to check all the major rivers.
If you stand by the riverbank long enough. Anyway, lovely to see you again, Mr. Goodall.
Very lovely to see you. Here we've got the 17th of January, and it's your first show. I'll tell you what, you have had a Stakhanovite start to the year as always, John. We really appreciate it.
I like to work extremely hard, but what I'm going to do is come back refreshed and firing on all cylinders. So let's talk about Biden and let's talk about the legacy, because when he came to office, it really felt like he was an old man in a hurry. There was so much legislation that he wanted to pass. And whilst an awful lot of people said, oh, he's just going to be this transitional figure, he's a very old man, actually he had a lot of legislative ideas that he wanted to push forward, and he had some success. You know, there were things that Joe Biden did that were successful. But I suspect for the moment they feel utterly overshadowed by all the things that went wrong, ultimately him staying in the race too long and perhaps paving the way for Donald Trump's return to office.
He's such an interesting, and I think history will conclude in a lot of ways, and we can talk a bit later about kind of how history often evolves when it comes to evaluating presidencies and how that happens. But I think he is right now he feels like such a tragic figure. In the sense that he is a man who, in so many ways, he gets to the presidency too late. He's a man who uniquely was able, it's clear, among the Democratic field in 2020, was uniquely able to bury Donald Trump, but he wasn't able to extinguish him. And indeed, partly because of the man himself and his own frailties, resurrected him, which we can talk about. But it's worth just thinking about, given we're looking down the barrel of another inauguration, thinking about what was a much more hopeful moment in 2021 when Biden was inaugurated, but also a really weird moment, right? A unique moment for all sorts of in all sorts of ways. Obviously, we'd had the unbelievable scenes of January the 6th, basically an attempted coup attempt, unique in the history of the Republic. Donald Trump, his predecessor, is not at his inauguration. And I think this is the thing that's really easy to forget in all of the kind of tumult of these years. This inauguration is also unique because it's taking place still in the heart of COVID and the COVID fight back. Let's just listen to a little bit of Biden's first speech, his inaugural address, back in January 2021.
Before God and all of you, I give you my word. I will always level with you. I will defend the Constitution. I'll defend our democracy. I'll defend America. And I'll give all of you, keep everything I do in your service, thinking not of power, but of possibilities, not of personal interest, but the public good. And together, we shall write an American story of hope, not fear.
And that is the core of Joe Biden, the decency, the upholder of traditional values. He's an institutionalist by nature. He reveres the institutions that make America great. Whereas Donald Trump has so often seemed to want to burn those institutions down and be a flamethrower to them. And it's just I was kind of virtually on the steps of the Capitol that day on his inauguration. And getting to the Capitol was, I have never navigated security like it, because Washington, D.C. had become a garrison town. The whole place had been sealed off by Humvees, by armored personnel carriers, by razor wire after January the 6th. And that was the context in which Joe Biden made those remarks about the need for decency and the need for a nation to come together. He just didn't quite have the capability to take out the toxicity and the polarization that has so marked America over this past decade. His aims were laudable. He did try to reach out across the aisle to Republicans, and some success in various places. But ultimately, the Americans that loved Donald Trump loathed Joe Biden and everything that he stood for. And, they were determined to undermine him.
Yeah, I think if we think about judging him on his own terms, Biden, what were his objectives coming into the office? Not just on any particular policy objective, but in the grand historical sweep. And as the oldest president ever to come to office, he had a strong sense of history, and he had a strong sense of who he wanted to be and who he wanted to admire. Which was the president he admired most? It was FDR. The great torchbearer of the Democratic Party, one of the transformative presidents of the 20th century in the whole American Republic. And he did so, of course, because he admired FDR, because he saw the legislative achievements that FDR made, basically the manufacture, the creation of the American welfare state insofar as it exists, the New Deal and so on. And insofar as he modelled himself on a president like that, it is absolutely true to say, and if Biden was sitting here, he would point to the four massive legislative accomplishments that he had. The American Rescue Plan, which was the post-COVID piece of legislation that got $1.9 trillion of stimulus and support to households and so on. The Inflation Reduction Act, a whole load of industrial subsidies designed to combat climate change and reindustrialize the American Midwest. The Infrastructure Investment Act, lots of American presidents had talked about getting an infrastructure plan through. He got it through with $1.2 trillion. And the Chips and Science Act, designed to revivify or create properly the American semiconductor market. These are big achievements. There is no two ways about that. And it is true to say that I think that Biden, possibly uniquely, because of his congressional experience and because of his long political career, he could identify, even in this hyper-polarized Washington, he could identify the few areas where there was some political space that he could drive through. And that was successful, and these things will endure. Although much of the benefit, ironically enough, political benefit, may well end up going to Donald Trump's door.
Exactly. That is such a critical point because, of course, what Joe Biden is doing, America has spasms where it spends money on infrastructure. You talked about FDR. That was certainly a time. Eisenhower, kind of the interstate highways that were built during President Eisenhower's time. And then kind of infrastructure was just left to crumble. And for the richest country in the world, living in America, there are times when you think it is third world in the state of so many of the regional airports, bus stations, roads, bridges that are falling down literally because no money has been spent on them. And Biden has done a lot. And I think people thought he would be a centrist figure who would just hold the fort. And yet he had the legislative ambition of, as you say, FDR, and also a bit of LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, who was in the 60s, introduced, the Voting Reform Act and kind of all sorts of landmark legislation that changed America and the war on poverty. And Biden wanted to have his own place in history with a much more ambitious, much more progressive bent to it than I think people had thought would be the case when he was running to be president.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, Biden governed further to the left than any
absolutely.
US president, arguably, since FDR. Certainly since the advent of the Reagan Revolution. And in some ways, as you say, John, it's quite surprising, right? Because if you take his long sweep, he wasn't known as a sort of firebrand in the Senate. He wasn't on the left of the Democratic Party. He was very good at finding where the center of politics had moved in the Democratic Party. And he sensed that the center of gravity within the Democrats had moved left. I think there is an interesting question as to whether he overinterpreted that in the country at large, and whether the country at large was ready, certainly perhaps on some of the social issues, was ready to move as progressive left or hard progressive as he came to govern. And I think that is part of, if we're looking at what happened in 2024, that is part of the autopsy of that, right? That is this slight irony that you have Biden, who is governing in lots of ways as a bit of an economic populist, and there's lots of continuity between him and Trump on that score, but also on terms of social issues and where the kind of excitement of the Democratic Party was, that it was perhaps a bit too much for parts of the American electorate to bear.
Yeah, I think so. You've got separate bits. The Biden administration actually ran very well. Compared to what had happened during the Trump years, where every day was chaos. I remember just after Joe Biden had taken up the reins of power, he'd moved into the White House, he's making decisions. I bumped into a senior diplomat and I said, God, what's it like with Biden now at the White House? And he says, well, it's amazing. There is discipline, there's a chain of command, there's process, there's order. And I said, what's the downside compared to Trump? And he said, well, there's discipline, there's a chain of command, there's order, and there's process. And, Biden did bring that in, but on three central things. And I think the social issues you're talking about, he did run ahead of public opinion. And I think Trump capitalized on that. The border and immigration, where he called for a more humane system to deal with those people coming up from the Northern Triangle, through Mexico, across the Rio Grande, and inflation. And, the US economy, compared to the anemic growth figures that we've just had announced this week in the UK, the US is growing like gangbusters. The economy is doing really well. But he couldn't eradicate inflation. And I think that really helped. So those three things, the social issues, immigration, and inflation, were the things that did for him, I think, in terms of, this period and the run up to the election.
Yeah, and I think in terms of inflation as well, it's very clear that the Democrats were too tin-eared, and Biden himself too tin-eared, in responding to how many ordinary Americans felt about the inflation problem. And to be honest, and I think this is a mistake it's a mistake that I can understand how he made, which is that, and again, I think the sort of COVID element of his presidency sort of feels so distant now, but obviously it was a huge part of those early days. And he was thinking that you're always fighting the last war, right? The stimulus package that he passed, as I say, huge amount of money, $1.9 trillion in stimulus money in the immediate wake in those early days of his presidency. He is thinking, again, he's got that FDR example in his head. And he's thinking, how do I avert here? We're going to face another Great Depression. How do I avert it? And he's got, of course, the Obama example in his head as well, because he was vice president, obviously, under Obama during the Great Recession. And as a result of various political factors that need not detain us, the stimulus they passed there ended up being too small to see off that slump. In the end, of course, what happened with COVID and the COVID spending was that probably, I think most economists would agree now, that 1.9 trillion was too big, that the damage to the capacity of the American economy had not been that great, that it was there to bounce back. But as a result of that spending, it did make inflation work. There were things that he did that made inflation better. And there were, stimulus payments given to people, child tax credits, lots of good things. But there were inflationary effects. And in the end, I think rightly, the administration got blamed for it.
The other thing we've got to talk about is Biden himself and his age. Yeah. I mean, the great sort of Teddy Roosevelt quote was that when you are the president, you have the bully pulpit, you have the nation's ear, you can stand and you can attack and you can kind of get your way, and you can start a fight in a way that other politicians just simply don't have the ability to do. And I think that actually the communication of Joe Biden and the way that he presented himself and his team presented him did him no favors in the long run. Yes, the operation was sophisticated at the White House, but just in terms of the communication, I think, when we were talking about this episode, Lewis, we were talking about, what are the clips, and our editors came up with a kind of list of things. They're invariably Biden gaffes, where he hasn't said something quite right, he's got it wrong, and people have just said, oh, can't you express this better? And that, of course, came to its absolute culmination in the CNN debate at the end of June, where the one and only debate he had against Donald Trump, which effectively sealed his fate.
Make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President.
Oh, God, I mean, even listening back to it now, it's so, again, I go back to that word. There is a tragedy to it. There is a tragedy to it. And I do think, John, I think two things about this. One, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the communications around Biden, I mean, that can make it sound sort of flippant or facile in some way. It's not that. An American president has to be able to draw the dots of his presidency, to create a narrative of his presidency, of being able to explain to the American public what it is that he is doing, especially in a media environment which is so fractured, and where you have an opponent, because Trump, this is what's extraordinary about Trump, right? He haunts the Biden presidency as well. It's not like he's gone away during any of this period. He's still on the stage the entire time, weaving his own narrative day after day, strong, which he always does. And Biden, particularly as time proceeded, and I think what's even sad as well, you can see when we're looking through the sort of early clips, you can already see a kind of a completely, or not completely, but somewhat different Biden, even in those early days, in terms of his ability to articulate what he's doing. So if we go to those signature initiatives, for example, like we talked about, the IRA, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, all signature stuff, all big stuff, all historic stuff. But did the American public really understand what they were about, what were the links between them, why they were good for them as opposed to good for Joe Biden and his legacy? Not always. And a lot of that sat with Biden's inability, to be honest, and an ability that got worse and worse over time to articulate what he was doing and why in clear, crisp, simple terms.
The thing about Biden, I kind of, when he was president, I went to Milwaukee with him on a trip on, kind of there and back on Air Force One, and he's doing a town hall meeting, and he's wonderful with the audience, empathetic and kind of kind and decent. Actually, he was also a very chippy person. He felt he'd always been underestimated. He always felt that people had sort of sneered at him, that he hadn't had an Ivy League education like so many others that have, kind of risen to the top of the Democratic Party. And he felt that kind of no one really appreciated him. And I just kind of can't help thinking that a part of this tragedy in him was his stubborn belief that only he could fight Trump in a second term, and stayed on until way, way too late. Impossible. I mean, maybe there are all sorts of areas where Kamala Harris should have done the campaign differently. But I still think overwhelmingly, she just did not have the time to define herself. She didn't have the time to do it. And because Biden had left it so late, it was impossible, in a sense, for it to be anyone other than Kamala Harris. as the Democratic torchbearer. If he had done what LBJ had done in '68, which was to give a few more months for the Democratic Party to choose who its candidate should be, then maybe it would have been different. But I just think that, that bit of his legacy, we're absolutely right to talk up all the legislative achievements which will have a long-lasting effect. One other long-lasting effect I just should mention, I think he's appointed something like 200 or 300 federal judges in the time that he has been president, and that will have a very lasting effect on the decisions that are made in the courts, because the courts do divide whether they are conservative or liberal.
Yeah, but as you say, John, you cannot set, and I think this will be obviously one of history's judgments that is inescapable, you cannot set the essay question for your presidency to be exercising MAGAism to protect the Republic from its return, and then for it to return on your watch. It can only be described as a failure, because he ended up being the only man who could defeat MAGAism in 2020 and was the handmaiden, absolutely the handmaiden to MAGAism's return in 2024 because of the decisions he made. And one other thing as well, and I think this will also influence how his presidency is seen, and we can't know this yet because we just do not have access to the documents. We don't have access, people haven't spoken candidly about it, but in time they will. The question of the cover-up about Biden's decline, I think, will be central, because it will be there for historians to see. We've all seen it, obviously reaching its apogee in that moment, in that debate. Historians will ponder the extent to which Biden was in control of his own presidency and his administration, particularly in the latter stages, and the extent to which senior Democratic officials, including Kamala Harris, were aware of his decline and what they did to try and arrest it, and also to try and do something about it in terms of the succession. And we will know far more about that. And I do think that was a big understated part of the Democrats' loss in 2024. I do think a lot of Americans felt that they had been misled. They could see that they had been misled. This was an administration and his officials that said day after day, week after week, the president's fine. He's the strongest person in the room. He's the most articulate person in the room. He always has the right question. All this stuff that then looked facile. And that was the thing, right? And this was what was such a gift to Trump. Trump's whole message always is, these elites are lying to you the entire time. Maybe I lie, but at least I don't pretend I don't lie, right? And for an administration that was predicated on the idea of restoring dignity and earnestness and honesty to government, I really think that was completely lethal.
Yes, there was such a dramatic mismatch between what everyone could see with their own eyes. And I had my own. I remember bumping into Biden at the G7 summit in Cornwall, and he was there, and I was with the British ambassador to Washington at a bar, and Biden and Jill Biden come and sit at the next table, and he just looked absolutely spent and shot, and was looking out into the mid-distance and kind of looked away with the fairies. There is a mismatch, undoubtedly, between what the American people saw and felt and what was being said in Washington and what was being publicly spoken about by the administration. And, you just think that in this day and age, with FDR, maybe you could cover up the fact that he was in a wheelchair, during the Second World War, because he had to project strength. But this is a social media age. It was just impossible. And yet it seems that the White House did try to cover it up. And those closest to Joe Biden, Jill Biden, and 2 or 3 other very close advisors just chose to keep it private, and I think misled the American people.
Yeah, and it intersected exactly with what we were talking about, which is the fact that as a result of his decline, he was unable to do press conferences. He did fewer press conferences and fewer interviews than any president of modern times, and that had a political effect. We should talk a bit about Biden on the world stage and his foreign policy, which we will do just after this.
So that's the domestic ledger for Biden. What about foreign policy? What about international standing? Because Joe Biden, when he became president, he went around the world with 3 words: America is back. That was how he wanted to sell what American foreign policy would be. In other words, it was part of the continuum from the Second World War that America would play a leading role in institutions like NATO, World Trade Organization. It would be a rule-obeying, rule-leading country that the rest of Europe and the rest of the free world could look to set an example. And that was what his aim was. I mean, there were an awful lot of people who were saying, yeah, but how long are you going to be around for? Almost kind of predicting that Donald Trump would be back, and they were right to have those fears. And I think it's a bit of a mixed ledger. You know, Ukraine, yeah, the way he reacted to that, the way he was kind of galvanizing support for Ukraine against Putin. But Afghanistan, the withdrawal was chaotic and arguably led to Ukraine. And then Israel, Gaza, how well has he done there?
Yeah, look, I think that Biden, he had many long years of foreign policy experience in the Senate. He was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate for years, and he had sort of contacts as long as your arm. He knew everybody. And so I think he did have a very acute sense of geopolitical competition. I think he had, and it's where it intersected with his domestic policy, right? He saw the world as a mixture, a combination, or an uneasy stasis, not a Cold War, as it was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, but a stasis between autocracy and democracy. And he thought that the 21st century would be a great power game between autocracy and democracy. And his presidency was about solidifying not only American democracy at home, but democracies around the world. And I think that analysis was right. The question is whether he was able to buttress democracy around the world. And he was in part. I think, a high point you could argue was Ukraine. He was very, very quick to realize what was going on. He plowed money and resources in early. And he articulated very well, early on at least, what was at stake. Let's just listen to Biden talking about those early days of the Ukraine war.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause.
But even there, I think you can say that Biden's legacy is checkered. I mean, I think a lot of Ukrainian government officials would say that Biden was always there when he needed them, but he was always slightly behind the curve of what they wanted. And he gave the Ukrainians enough to fight, but the critique would be not enough to win. And as well, it goes back to the point we keep making about communication. Initially, there was a lot of unanimity in America, not universal, but there was more unanimity certainly than there is now about the importance of supporting Ukraine. That eroded and eroded and eroded. And it partly eroded because, again, Biden was unable to communicate to the American public why it was so important that America kept its obligations not only to NATO, but also supported Ukraine to defeat basically Russian fascism. But he was never able, again, consistently to create that message and fill that gap. And guess who filled it instead? Well, it was Donald Trump and MAGA. And so now we have the absurdity of an incoming administration, many of its supporters basically lauding Vladimir Putin and not Volodymyr Zelensky.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I remember Clinton when he was president, and it was the Balkans and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and Clinton communicating so brilliantly to the American people. He kind of came in and said, we're going to roll down the map, and we're going to have a look at why this matters to us here and why you should be concerned about what is happening with the breakup and the Serbs and all the rest of it. And I think that he was really effective in that. And Joe Biden could never make that narrative either. And I know you spoke about it on the podcast yesterday about, was it Donald Trump who kind of came to the rescue of the Middle East kind of peace deal for Gaza and a ceasefire? And in a way, I think that probably Trump has been tougher on Netanyahu, even though you would always think that, Trump and Netanyahu were sort of joined at the hip. It was Trump who forced the pace on all of this. And something that Biden had kind of, come up with last May has finally going to get over the line this weekend because of Trump's involvement in it. And you kind of see, I don't think that Biden has won friends anywhere. As he's tried to steer a middle path, well, I don't know whether he has tried to steer a middle path. He's been very, very pro-Israel in an awful lot of things, but has had absolutely zero leverage in return for his pro-Israel support from Netanyahu, who has just ignored Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think that fairly or unfairly, for many Americans, and indeed, many around the world, one of the themes of the Biden presidency, and of course it's not all in his control, all of his own making, of course it isn't, but there has been a feeling that Biden, and the one that Trump has prosecuted relentlessly, a feeling that the world is on fire, that the events were simply escaping his control, and all of those sort of parallels drawn between him and one of his heroes, Jimmy Carter, of course, has recently died. There's just a feeling of chronic instability in the world that Biden did not have the energy or the vim or the will or the means to try and take control of, if any American could. But I think that reaches its encapsulation with the Israel-Gaza question. And I think that there is a pretty big black mark against Biden in this regard, because as you say, John, I think this was where Biden's age became a problem in a slightly different way, in that I think that he had and continues to have a conception of Israel that frankly is somewhat out of date, and that he was simply unwilling to show the flexibility that, in fairness, Trump, I think, is going to show in dealing with Netanyahu and forcing him to come to the table, forcing him to do what the American president wanted. And what happened is that in being willing to castigate Netanyahu, but being fundamentally unwilling to do anything about it, it made him look impotent, and it made him look weak, which was precisely the political charge that was being made against him day after day. And yeah, we'll get a ceasefire now, but what an appalling humanitarian cost in the interim.
Completely. And look, maybe Biden, no president could have done anything about it. Maybe, Netanyahu was particularly in a unique situation because of the pressure he had from his own right wing with these rather unsavory characters that formed the coalition government with him. Maybe that was, no president could have got Netanyahu into a different position. But it did look like a policy fail that it went on so long. I just want to talk about one small kind of domestic point from the British standpoint, which is, of course, Britain left the European Union. We are still no closer to a trade deal. And that goes back to something you were saying much earlier, Lewis, that about there is a line of continuity in the economic populism and economic nationalism that has stayed from Trump to Biden. And you know what? It's about American jobs for American workers. It's not about doing trade deals with the UK or anyone else for that matter. And I think that Britain is still going to have quite a wait before it gets a bespoke trade deal with the United States of America.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, which I think it's so easy to get caught up in the now. We don't know what happens next. But I think when historians look back, they will see and they will note the continuity between Trump and Biden. Clearly not in tone, not in attachment or sentiment, not in the way they talk about democracy or the American Republic, not in their personalities. All of that could not be more different. If you take the really long view and you take the broad sweep of kind of American economic history, where you go from FDR and the New Deal, and you say that settlement, the New Deal settlement, lasted from 1945 to 1980, say, with Ronald Reagan. Then you have what you might call a kind of neoliberal settlement, for want of a better expression, free markets, all of these sorts of things, monetarism, that lasts from 1980 pretty much to 2008, certainly the great financial crisis, but even includes Obama. Even Obama is the kind of last president of that old order, trying to kind of patch and mend and keep that order alive. Trump is the break. Trump is the break into something new, an age, as you say, of economic nationalism, of a rejection of that old neoliberal order, of a very different sort of Republican Party, far more economically populist, and the Democratic Party has responded to that as well. And that new era started with Trump, and it had a lot of continuity with Joe Biden. He doesn't try and go back to the pre-Trump economic order, that old political world. In many ways, he cements it. So there is going to be, we are in the middle of a new order, and Joe Biden was continuity in terms of that new political world that Trump created.
I wonder whether there is something of the John Major about the Joe Biden presidency, in the sense that, John Major bequeathed Tony Blair all sorts of things that were really good for Blair in terms of the economy and all the rest of it. And I wonder whether, Trump is now going to inherit an economy which is growing really well. The inflation still needs to be brought down a bit. But there are all sorts of pieces of legislation that I bet you anything you like, Trump won't undo. Although he has decried, for example, let's take one example, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's leading to the building of all sorts of factories across America where they're doing environmental protection. So it's creating thousands and thousands of jobs. Is Donald Trump going to rip all of that up?
It's
No.
it's the biggest act of industrial policy that we've seen in 50 years. I mean, it's
Exactly.
extraordinary, the amount of money spent, the amount of subsidy. This is what I mean about the embedding this new order. He basically rewrote the rule book and created a new type of political economy for the United States. And that is huge.
Yes, and so I kind of think that those areas, and it was right that we dwelt at the top of this episode on the legislative achievement, because the CHIPS Act, which is all about making, America competitive with China in terms of semiconductors, which are so vital for the modern kind of information economy. The Inflation Reduction Act, as you talk about, the kind of infrastructure plans, which are vital for America as well. These are big ticket things that Biden has achieved. I just think in narrow political terms that he's going to be treated harshly, that he stayed around too long, past his sell-by date, should have gone earlier. And it was a huge miscalculation, a huge piece of hubris on his part to believe that only he and he alone could defeat Donald Trump in 2024.
And it must have been quite something for him to sit there as he did a few weeks ago with his predecessor and successor. Only the second presidents have had the same predecessor and successor. Donald Trump next to him in the Oval Office, affording him a privilege, a decency that Donald Trump did not and would never ever extend to anyone else, which is the recognition of his victory and accepting, as much as it absolutely must have sort of repulsed every cell in his body, of sitting next to him and assuring him that there would be a smooth transition. And it reminded me of, and when we're thinking about the sort of historical sweep, and this, as you say, John, because he does have a cheapness, which I can kind of understand given the way he's been treated at times by the Democratic establishment, the American political establishment, all that sort of stuff. But he must know, maybe deep in his bones, something that Dominic Sandbrook, the historian, said, which I was very taken by, is that when he was asked, how do you think that Joe Biden will be judged and viewed in history? And he said, and how pained would Biden be if he heard this? He said, he will be viewed as a very important character in the Donald Trump story. So, John, we're trying to do something here which is basically impossible, right? Which is sort of say, how will Joe Biden be judged by history when his presidency hasn't even officially ended yet? And I suppose we should say that the caveat to all this, right, is that history, and particularly historical evaluation of American presidents, and even how the American public over time sees their presidents as time progresses, does change dramatically, right? I mean, who'd have thought that, for example, George W. Bush, leaves office in 2009 with, record low approval ratings, blamed for the warmonger in Iraq, the financial crash, all the rest of it. Now seen as quite a kindly old Texan gentleman, a good old boy, who is a sort of defender of the values of the Republic and not like Trump, and all of these sorts of, things. Jimmy Carter, who's just died, seen as complete failure at the time when he leaves office in 1981, again just dies, and everyone talks about what a great humanitarian he was and what great values he had. These things do change as events go on, and for Biden, the way that Biden is viewed will inevitably depend on what Trump does next and how successful or otherwise he is in his second non-consecutive term.
One other thing, I think the Carter comparison is really interesting, because I think there are kind of areas where the Biden presidency echoes with the Carter presidency. There's one huge glaring difference. Carter had the most phenomenal afterlife after he was president. All the things that he did,
it's a bit early to judge what the afterlife is like for him, surely.
No. Post-presidential life, let me frame it like that, which was exceptional, about human rights, about being a real kind of figure on the world stage with a kind of moral. There is not going to be a huge kind of post-presidential life for Joe Biden, given the state in which we have seen him be. And so he's not going to have the chance. I mean, the great Churchill quote is, history is written by the winners and I'm going to be the one writing it. I don't think Biden is going to have that chance to have the space to be able to write the history as he would want it done. Now, there will be people around who have got a lingering affection for Joe Biden, but the point that you make of Sandbrook makes is absolute killer, isn't it? That he will be the bit part in the Trump story.
And I think you're so right about that point, John, about his not being able to have the time to rehabilitate himself, because again it goes back, everything always goes back to the unusual situation, his being so old when he takes the presidency, right? And the norm in recent years has been for presidents to have long time, decades out of office to kind of shape that narrative, shape that post-presidential life. I mean, Bill Clinton's been out of office for 25 years now. Clearly for obvious reasons, Joe Biden is not gonna have that, right? And his place even within the Democratic Party, right, is complicated because so many will, for a long time, blame him for not withdrawing when they think he should have done, and again being the handmaiden to that Trump restoration. And even just on a personal level, it is the effect Trump has had, right, is so astonishing when you think basically now all of these senior top Democrats who have spent all of these years in the trenches together, who have very strong political bonds, Obama, Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Biden, loads of sub-characters beyond that. I mean, most of them are barely speaking to each other these days, right? Because they have all basically the toxin of Trump and what to do about Trump and the blame game between each other for each one thinking that they're basically responsible is so toxic and so deep. So the Democratic Party itself will have a very complicated relationship with Biden, I think, for many years.
There was a great Lyndon B. Johnson quote when he was getting a really crap time from the media, when he said, if I went down to the Potomac and was able to walk across it, the headline would be, President can't swim. There you are. That's a great
Some
quote.
compliment for Joe Biden. We'll see you. I'll see you actually in person next week. Finally.
Look forward to it.
I can't wait. All right. See you then, John. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.